Hello, Heroes Media Group friends, fans, and family. I'm HMG Chief Marketing Officer and article contributor Robert Patrick Lewis. We're going to a little bit of a different format here where we're going to start creating videos for each of these articles that we write. Number one, I know I write some pretty long articles and I try to include as many cross-reference links as I possibly can. And a lot of people just don't have time for that anymore, so we're going to try to follow up so we can do everything we can to get this information out to you guys. For those of you who don't have time to read an article, we'll follow up with a YouTube video so we can go through and explain a lot of the stuff that's going on. It's been a while since I've made a YouTube video, so bear with me. This might be a little rough on this one. They'll get better, I promise. Because we're doing the articles, I'm going specifically off my notes because I want to make sure we cover all of the information in the article. I go to pretty great pains to make sure that I find different links in every article I write so that you guys can follow links and do any research on your own that you want, but it makes them pretty long. So I will have links to a lot of this stuff. Number one, you can go and either read the article itself or even just follow the links for all the cross-reference stuff that I put out there for you. But I'll also have it in the show notes for this video. So under where you see the video, there should be a little section that has information about this specific one, and I'll put a bunch of links in there. So if there's something you want to follow up on, you can just follow it directly from there. So we're going to go ahead and talk today about an article that we published a few weeks ago called California GOP Voter Suppression and the Wildfire Connection. We sent this out via newsletter the day after we published it, and we got some nasty messages. We had some people unsubscribe. We had some people get a little upset. I want to make something very clear to you. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm not telling you what to believe. One of the things with me is I'm very good at looking at things in the macro. So I pay attention to a lot of news from a lot of various sources, and I don't find many of them that are accurate. And that's a thing you got to understand. The term fake news is pretty popular these days. Fake news isn't just stories being improperly written or blatant lies in headlines. It can be lies by omission, and we'll talk about a couple of those in this article where you see something that the media is talking about a story and they leave out very significant details, and we'll have a couple of different examples in this article and in this video that we talk about. It can also be misdirection and reframing, and so that for me is really what gets my spidey sense going. Again, I look at things, the macro picture. I take in as many different news sources as I can. So when I see different pieces put together from all these different things, but I see certain ones that are leaving out key details, that sends off my spidey senses. And so that's one of the things that I don't know why, but for some reason I'm good at looking at things in the big picture and putting together different points that people either purposely are not putting together or other people just seem to have missed. And again, a big part of that is just because that's the way I look at things. But again, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but I will just lay out a lot of different things that I've seen, some very strange timing and chain of events that have happened. Very personally for me, I'm recording this from my house in Los Angeles. So all those fires were very close to my house, so much so that my neighborhood was filled with smoke for a couple of weeks, and we had to take my future stepdaughter in to live with us because the fire was less than a mile from her dad's house. It was on the hill in his backyard. It was pretty nuts. So these are all pretty personal to me. And again, I've got a closer view of a lot of this stuff than a lot of people. And some of the experiences with voting actually happened to me. So I'm not just talking about reports that I've heard, but my firsthand experience. And we'll go through a little bit of that. But it scares me that this isn't being discussed, that a lot of people seem to have not put these pieces together, and just all the different things that have gone on. So let's go ahead and talk about the article. So the article is California GOP Voter Suppression and the Wildfire Connection. So where do we begin with all of this? Let's start with voter ID laws, right? So we've heard quite a bit over the last few years that anybody requiring a law that requires an ID to vote is racist, right? It's racist and it's alarmist and it's a terrible thing. We've heard that kind of subside lately for a pretty significant reason. I mean, it's become blatantly obvious when people have pointed out, you need an ID in this country to drive a car, apply for Social Security, apply for welfare, buy a house, get a job, buy cigarettes, buy alcohol, do any number of things. Yet somehow it's called racist for one of the things that is a defining characteristic of our country, and that's free and open elections. So people have been able to kind of see through that narrative that's complete BS, and so people have moved on to some other things. They went away from the voter ID as racist because people have started to realize that that is kind of ridiculous. Now, there is a very important point to make here, to be perfectly candid. I'm a very conservative person. I'm more libertarian than Republican or Democrat. I am a huge supporter of President Trump, although I was not in the beginning. I wasn't really a fan of his until, again, I was able to take in that macro picture and see when he got in office that he actually started doing all the things that he was going to say he was going to do. And he was doing things that were really good for our country. I'm an MBA, so I look at a lot of the numbers, the economic stuff, the business stuff that he's doing. And number one, he put his money where his mouth was. He did everything that he promised he was going to do. But seeing these places where he's turning knobs in the economy and actually doing a good job. I'm an investor, so stocks for the last year have been great. You could just throw a dart at a board and make money. But all the other things that he's done to make a better business climate from what he can do, I've been a huge fan of. So, don't really belong to either one of the political parties. I am a big supporter of President Trump. But a lot of conservative people and a lot of, I guess, the media in general, and this is another red flag, has not told people about the consent decree. If you've never heard about the consent decree, there's a link in the article. I'll put another link in the show notes. So in 1982, the GOP was actually found guilty of disenfranchising voters. It wasn't voter ID laws or anything like that, and the specifics are a little bit too deep to get into here. But just know that the GOP was actually found guilty of doing that in 1982, and it led to something called the consent decree. The consent decree is one of the more ridiculous things I've ever heard of. And again, the fact that nobody in the media ever told us about this, that this wasn't just household common knowledge, kind of lets you know, like, hey, this has been going on for a while where the media has been leaving some very specific things out, some very important specific things out of the public knowledge, and it's a little ridiculous. So what the consent decree was it was an agreement between the GOP and the DNC saying that the DNC could not be investigated for any kind of voter fraud, voter irregularities, anything. Right now, I want you to think about that, right? So our power has gone back and forth basically every 8 years for quite a while. And it always blew my mind because when you look at data from our country, the United States of America is heavily more conservative than liberal when you actually look at party affiliations of people. There are a lot of big blue holdouts, but the vast majority of this country, not just in land, but in people, is conservative once you get out of the major urban centers. So I've always thought that was strange. You know, when we just had the midterm elections, which we're going to get into significantly here, I've always thought that was odd. So when I learned about the consent decree and the fact that the GOP was not allowed to investigate the DNC in any instance of alleged voter fraud, things started to make a little bit more sense. Now, the consent decree did actually end under President Trump. So it's been renewed every year since 1982. It ended under President Trump. So that's, I think, an important thing about why we're seeing something happen this year that we've never really seen before, with a lot of this stuff actually being investigated. Investigated so much, actually, that he went through and created an election integrity task force shortly after taking office. Now, that's a very important thing to think about. And another kind of aspect of fake news where you hear something reported but not quite accurately. So there used to be an election integrity unit under the DOJ. But if you've been paying attention to politics a lot lately, a lot of the people who have been getting hauled in front of Congress that are losing their jobs and going to jail because we find out they've been dirty, a lot of them are from the DOJ. Bruce Orr, Peter Strzok, Andy McCabe. There were a lot of bad actors in the DOJ. That's not a conspiracy theory. That is fact, right? If you've been paying attention to it, you know that. So Trump ended it under the DOJ and moved it under the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS. Now, one of the things that I thought was very important, and I knew that this was onto something when I heard this, was an NPR article. I used to be a huge fan of NPR. I still listen to them every day. I used to actually support them quite a bit. And I heard them report on this and talk about the election integrity unit and say that President Trump had disbanded it. End of story. They didn't talk about the fact that he disbanded it under the DOJ and restarted it under the DHS. Now, why would he do that? Again, that's something that we can't really get into in this video, but it's just important to know. NPR, they were one of the few that was kind of in the middle up until President Trump got elected. And once he did, they jumped on the crazy train with everybody else, and they went as far left as they could. And I stopped believing anything that I hear from them now. But it's still important. Know your enemy, right? It's still important to read other papers that you don't agree with, talk to people who have different ideologies than you have, and listen to news reports from other news, because you kind of see what they're thinking. And again, if you pay a lot of attention and you see all the different things that are going on, you can pick up what's important because you find what they're deliberately lying about. So I thought that was very, very interesting that he changed that. They didn't report that he moved into the DHS, but it seems like they're very busy right now because we got a lot going on after these midterm elections. A very good point to look at and understand the consent decree and how it didn't end until President Trump is to look at Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So there is a great YouTube video where Tracy Beans interviews Tim Canova. If you were paying attention to anything at all over during the midterm elections, Tim Canova in Florida posted a video on YouTube that went all across social media where he saw ballots that were being loaded from the backs of pickup trucks into vans, into just plain Ryder vans. There were no sheriffs around, so a very important thing to maintain election integrity. Whenever votes are moved, ballots are moved, there's supposed to be a sheriff present. They have specific packaging, all this stuff. And we could see in Broward County, that was not happening at all. And Broward County just happens to be where they found tens of thousands of votes after the voting was done. And as it turns out from this video, it really does seem like they just came from a warehouse somewhere. So Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the politician that Tim Canova was running against in this election, and he also ran against her in 2016. So it's very important to look at this, that 2016, if you listen to this interview between Tracy Beans and Tim Canova, he had a lot of these same things that happened to him this year, happened to him that year. Brenda Snipes, they had a massive difference in exit polls and votes, to the point where there were a lot of people that thought they had something in the machine that actually switched Canova votes, because he had so much more support from Republicans and Democrats and independents than Debbie Wasserman Schultz did. She had the IT scandal with the Awan brothers. She was fired from the head of the DNC and immediately hired onto Hillary's campaign for her part in knocking Bernie Sanders out of the primary. She is the face of political corruption, yet she won. Now in 2016, they didn't do anything about it. He brought it, and this this interview, Tim Canova goes on and talks about a lot of the different things that he did to bring this up to the different integrity task forces. Not a thing happened. The consent decree was still in place. But now that the consent decree has been lifted, when the same things happened this year, and now they got a lot more data, they got a lot of professional statisticians that looked at exit pollings versus the poll results and are backing up what Canova says. Plus, we have all the videos of the different just shady things that were going on in Broward County. They're actually looking into it now. The Florida Secretary of State has filed 4 different lawsuits for irregularities that are going on in Florida. So there are some very interesting things. I know the key point when we're talking about fake news, there was an article that came out earlier this week where New York Times, or one of the regular culprits, was saying that Brenda Snipes was being improperly targeted because she was black. No, it's because she's a criminal. But again, when you know, as what's his name from The Blaze likes to say, Glenn Beck likes to, as he likes to say, if you should hold, when they go to the race, when they pull out the race card, that's how you know that you're onto something, because they got nothing left. They're shooting with blanks at that point. So a couple of points of fake news. It's just important stuff to talk about. So with all these different craziness that's going on in Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, basically all around the country, have you heard anything about the midterm elections in California? We've had the same things happen here. We had a lot of seats that were projected 100% to go to conservatives, where they flipped. We had ballots coming in after voting was actually done that were magically found and changed the complete totals. We had a lot of very strange things that happened here, but we haven't been hearing about it at all. Why? Why have we heard about Florida and Georgia and Texas and Arizona, but not California? Well, we had a couple of events that came up here. We had the Thousand Oaks shooting, and we had the fires. We had 3 different fires that were ravaging the entire state that took all of the media attention. And it was very strange. The shooting happened the day after midterms. So when people here in California started talking, there were some conservative voices on Twitter and on different social media that were talking about the crazy things that had happened to them when they were trying to vote. And I'll share my story here in a little bit. All of that got drowned out immediately because the day after we had the Thousand Oaks shooting, and the day after that we had 3 fires across the state of California, one of which just happened to happen in Thousand Oaks, which was right where the shooting happened. Now, speaking of conservative voices on Twitter, we got to give a lot of kudos to James Woods. He's got a really good following. Twitter has messed with him a lot, the Twitter oligarchy, Jack Dorsey. But he used his voice for good. He was doing a lot of good for the Paradise Fire specifically, trying to help people out, trying to put together people that had lost pets or lost family members. He was using this platform that he has to try actually do a lot of good. So kudos to him, because that's something that you just don't hear about a lot. So let's get back to California now and what actually happened here. So another important part in the media and another important lie by omission that you are hearing talking points from the media about is Trump, right? So every time President Trump has said something about election fraud or election integrity, the media loves to come out and say that President Trump is crazy. He keeps talking about voter fraud, but he doesn't have any proof of this actually happening, and he's just talking with no legal basis. He's saying all this with no evidence. Well, we do actually have quite a bit of evidence, and again, it's significant that the media keeps saying he keeps talking about voter fraud with no evidence of voter fraud when we do have evidence of voter fraud. So there's a ring arrested in Texas shortly before the elections of, I think, 9 people that were signing up non-citizens to vote and doing some other crazy stuff. So that happened right before the elections. There was another ring arrested here in Los Angeles, I believe, last week, where they had, again, I think 9 people. They were going down to Skid Row and getting homeless people and either giving them cash or cigarettes or whatever else to fill out fake ballots. We had buses of immigrants in Texas that were caught coming across the border with $100 in cash that they had been paid to vote for, guess who? Beto O'Rourke. Robert Beto O'Rourke. So we've actually had quite a bit of that. So when the media keeps saying there is no proof of voter fraud, we have quite a bit of proof. The Florida Secretary of State has filed 4 different lawsuits now for stuff that happened this year. So we do have plenty of evidence. So anytime you hear anybody in the media saying that we don't, they're lying. They're straight up lying to you. Here in California, though, we didn't really need evidence of the voter fraud, even though we have people that are going to jail for it. We have city council members that had their offices raided last week, and a lot of other things. But here in California, the results of the election alone were enough to send up red flags for a lot of us. And again, I'll share my personal experience on voting day here. But just picking all that out, looking at the election results, it's obvious to see that there's something really fishy going on. And I'll go through each of these examples and explain why, and then I'll tell you my own personal experience and what really got me digging into this. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Texas. I went to college. I did my undergrad in Texas. I signed up in the delayed entry program, so I left for the Army a month after I graduated college in Texas, and that was kind of the first time that I moved out. So in the Army for about 8 years. When I got out of the Army, my now ex-wife was here in California, so I moved out here. So I've been here for about 10 years since leaving the Army, 8 years, since I left the Army. But I still go back and forth to Texas quite a bit. For the last 4 years, I've been going back to Texas, either living there for a week and coming back here on weekends, or living here for a week and going there on weekends. I did my MBA in Texas while my family's out here. So I've been back and forth a lot. The reason that I bring that up is because I have a lot more insight and inside knowledge to both cultures in California and Texas than I think most would, right? A very important thing is that when I was in Dallas, we did some work with the Chamber of Commerce, and we saw a statistic that there were something like 1,000 people a month moving from California to Dallas alone. Now, that's not counting Houston and Austin, all the other parts of Texas. Dallas alone had something like 1,000 Californians a month. Maybe it was a week. It was a very large number. Basically, that's because a lot of people in California have had enough, right? They're taking off for whatever reason, and we'll go through a lot of the different reasons in a little bit, but people here in California have had enough. And I've met a lot of former Californians in Texas. I've met a lot of former Texans in California that are trying to get back as soon as they can. But people have basically had enough. If you've never listened to Victor Davis Hanson, I highly suggest you do. Very intelligent guy. He's great. Works at Stanford, works actually for a lot of different places, lives on a farm in a rural part of California outside of the Bay Area. So he works a day during the Bay, during the day in the Bay, which is the craziest liberal enclave, and then goes and lives in a rural town on a farm when he's done with work at the end of the day. So he, kind of like me, gets to see just how different these two cultures are. And you should, if nothing else, go watch his YouTube clip about the two Californias, talking about the two complete different cultures, even within California. And it's crazy, where you have the elite in the San Francisco Bay, the Bay Area, that view things completely one way, and then as soon as you get out of that, or Los Angeles, you get a completely different mindset. California has elected several conservative governors. Everything north of San Francisco is a lot more conservative. Down here, it's a little nuts. San Diego is okay because it's got such a large military community. Los Angeles, there are a few conservative kind of enclaves. Ronald Reagan at one point called Orange County the place where all good conservatives go to die. So California is not as blue as people think. It's just the major conservative centers. But go look up Victor Davis Hanson, The Two Californias, and watch all of his stuff if you really want to get some good insights from somebody who's on it firsthand. It really is amazing. So why are people fleeing California for Texas? Extremely high taxes, right? It's not just the personal income tax. It's everything else. They tax everything here, and it's extremely high. There's an anti-business climate, right? So I once had dinner with someone, and I overheard a lawyer talking to two of his clients at the table next to us, and they were asking about incorporating their new company. And they asked, do we just incorporate here? And he said, no, that's insane. Nobody incorporates in California. That would be the death of your company. And that brings up a very good point. The only thing you can be sure about in California regarding business climate is that it's going to be worse next year. That's it. It gets worse and worse and worse. Over 50% of California pays no income tax because of the different tax brackets. So that 50% that actually works, actually they just get bled dry. And we'll talk about regressive and progressive taxes in a little bit as well. So whether you work or not, I mean, people just get hit like crazy. So we got the anti-business climate, the high taxes, the regulations, and just it's very anti-conservative in certain areas. And it really is. It's funny because people talk about disenfranchised voters in terms of voter ID laws, but there is not a larger group of disenfranchised voters than conservatives here in California because the jungle primary system and the way things work, basically people here just don't believe that their votes go for anything if you're a conservative. I mean, you might as well throw your vote away, right? Even though we still try. I definitely, I still support still trying, but it's gotten a little scary. So why live with that? If you are a conservative person, why live in a state where you have taxation with no representation, right? Where everything goes contrary to what you believe. Another thing that people are leaving, we're paying these exorbitant taxes, and where do they go? The infrastructure is crumbling. The schools are failing. Where is all that money going, right? Because it's definitely not going to the things it's supposed to go to. So I did a little bit of digging into this as well. The Federation for American Immigration Reform, FAIR, has some calculations on their website. I had a link in the article, and I can put one in the show notes here as well. Their estimates put $6,517 every year going to illegal aliens here in California, care for them, social services, things like that. That comes up to about $23 billion a year. $23 billion a year. So that's where our taxes are going. If you don't agree with that, if you'd rather have your hard-earned taxes go to your kid's school or the highways or something else, and you don't agree with that, then that's why a lot of people are leaving. But again, I talked about the red flags earlier. If you were to look at the election results from this past midterm election, you would believe that people are okay with the status quo because that's how people voted. And I'll go through exactly how. We have a different kind of system here where if you can get a certain amount of signatures for any initiative, it gets put on the ballot, the people get to vote about it. And there are some very specific issues on the ballot this year that, again, that basically, if the election results are to be believed, then it would tell us that everybody here is okay with the taxes and the people that have led to the downfall of California, which should be a pretty big red flag for everybody. So I'm going to give the red flags, and I'm also going to give my physical experiences of voting here. So talking about the red flags, let's start with the big one, Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom he ran for governor here in California. And when we talk about swamp creatures, Gavin Newsom is the swampiest of the swamp creatures. Now, a lot of times politicians, Hillary Clinton did this, politicians that have been in politics their entire life love to talk about how, they know how the system works, they're here to fight for you, and they've been in this for their entire life, so they know what they're doing. Well, okay, I can understand that in some situations. It seems like our country has a different climate with Donald Trump, where we're starting to realize that sometimes it's better to get outsiders. And we had that in this election. We had an outsider, John Cox, who was a businessman, lawyer, a lot of different things, running against Gavin Newsom, who's been in politics, California politics, his entire life. So you get to the point where you see a state like California where you would be hard-pressed. And I talk to a lot of different people of a lot of different persuasions every day. You would be hard-pressed to find somebody here in California that thinks California is better today than it was 10 years ago. And that's just, I don't care who you talk to or how they feel. I mean, the schools are terrible. They're failing. Charter schools here, it seems like every day you hear an ad against charter schools, but their lines for their sign-up, because there's you got to get in a sign-up lottery to get into the charter schools, they are thousands of people long because public schools here are terrible. One of the highest tax states in the nation, public schools are at the low. They're like number 48 in the nation. They're terrible. Gavin Newsom's one of the reasons that it's like that. Gavin Newsom's been in California politics for his entire career. He has been one of the people making all of these decisions that have led the state straight downhill. He was the mayor of San Francisco from 2004 to 11. He was lieutenant governor of California from 2011 until now. So he's been doing this for quite a while, and he has a hand in all these policies that have destroyed the state. Now, I'm not sure if you listen to Adam Carolla podcast or not. A lot of people do. Again, I will link this, but I highly suggest you go listen to Adam Carolla's interview with Gavin Newsom. I don't know how this happened. I don't know if maybe his team didn't vet Carolla at all or didn't realize he was a conservative voice, but it's a beautiful interview. He caught him in quite a few logic bombs. He brought up the fact that Newsom blatantly lied about his background, saying that he was a blue-collar upbringing of a poor single mom who worked 3 jobs and all these other things. Same Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said they came from rough and tumble and humble beginnings. Well, Carolla brought up the fact, no, your dad was a lawyer for Getty Oil. Your dad made a lot of money, so please stop this. Same with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez up in New York. Said she came from a blue-collar background, really rough life growing up. When people actually researched, they found out she grew up in one of the highest income zip codes in the country, right? So that right there should be something that it's a red flag. When somebody's lying that blatantly about their background, it should be a red flag for you. Gavin Newsom has tons of red flags. Again, if you've never listened to it, Adam Carolla podcast, Gavin Newsom. I've been on the Carolla show a couple of times, and I've got friends that work there in their studio. And after this interview, it was so bad for Newsom because Carolla didn't give him the free pass that a lot of media gives him. He actually took him to task on a few things, and they tried to put the screws to him. But Carolla, thankfully, he's got a good enough audience, and he's stubborn enough that he stuck to his guns. But you should. You can check it out on YouTube, check it out on iTunes. I'll put the link in the show notes, but you should definitely listen to it. So Newsom was neck and neck with John Cox, the guy that I talked about earlier, all for the weeks leading up to the election. Now, why is that important? Conservatives generally aren't polled and don't respond to polls, right? So when you see polling numbers, a lot of conservatives just don't respond to, or statisticians specifically. So one of the things that polls are used, they're weaponized now, where people use them. Behavioral economics states that people want to be on the winning team. So people don't want to vote for what they think is already a losing cause. It's a subconscious thing we do. Read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, or How We Tick. Some great ones about behavioral economics. But just at the basic level, even if we don't realize it, we always want to be on the winning team, so sometimes unconsciously we'll skew ourselves that way. So when a poll comes out and it's paid for by one specific party or not, they want to put out a poll that makes everybody think it's in the bag, we're going to win, period, right? So conservatives generally don't respond as much as liberals do to polls. And pollsters, if they're paid by a specific party or they're paid from someone who wants it to lean a specific way, it's very easy to make a poll say whatever you want, right? Statistics, what is it? There's lies, and damn lies. Statistics are damn lies, or something like that. If somebody gives you statistics or a poll and they don't give you their degree of confidence, just understand it's probably fake, right? So a lot of the stuff you see on news, statistics, if you increase your degree of confidence, so basically making the numbers less specific, you can make statistics say pretty much anything you want. And you can pick where you do your poll. You can pick your sample size. You do a sample size of 100 people in Los Angeles. You can be pretty sure of where it's going to be rather than 20,000 people from all across the country, right? So there's some very important things that you need to pay attention to. Even with all that, John Cox was neck and neck in the polls with Gavin Newsom leading all the way up to it. So it was very strange that if conservatives do not respond to polls as much, and Gavin Newsom was neck and neck, who is the GOP candidate for governor, if he was neck and neck with Gavin Newsom the entire time, common logic would dictate that when conservatives actually did show up at the polls, it should have been a landslide. It should have been a landslide for John Cox. However, it was a landslide in the opposite direction. Just like we saw with Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Broward County, it almost seems as if somebody switched every vote for the conservative to a vote for the liberal, somehow magically, because all the numbers should have been with the GOP contender versus the swamp creature. Another big question we should ask is, why was the race called when only 9% of the vote was tallied? That's a little crazy, right? So 9% of the vote, not counting any provisional ballots, which we'll go through in a little bit, but it just doesn't even make sense. And why was Fox reporting the results before the polls were even closed? Right? There's a lot of crazy things that went on in these elections that we just don't even have time to get into, but there's red flags everywhere. It was just very strange. So Gavin Newsom, long story short, swamp creature, please listen to the Adam Carolla podcast. Another race that we had here in California was Dianne Feinstein and Kevin Ghost Gun Leon. Look up Kevin Ghost Gun Leon on YouTube. It's great. He's a rabidly anti-Second Amendment California politicians that had this great thing where they recorded him giving some kind of speech about guns, where he showed that he has no clue about guns whatsoever. I mean, it really is. It's like every single thing he says is absolutely wrong. He either had somebody on his staff write his speech or talking points that was just a big prankster and wanted to see him make as much of a joke of himself out of as he could, or he really is that ignorant. So between those two, it's a lesser of two evils, right? California has a jungle primary, which means that it's the highest number of votes that get put on the ballot. So instead of having a Republican and a Democrat on the ballot next to each other, if the highest votes are always for Democrats, you'll have two Democrats. And that's what happened. We had Dianne Feinstein and Kevin De Leon, which was a little ridiculous. Dianne Feinstein won hers by a landslide. Now, why is that important? What can we look at with Dianne Feinstein? Well, in the last year alone, just in the last year, we found out Dianne employed a Chinese spy for 20 years and let the Chinese spy go without any kind of prosecution, without looking into it, just let him go and leave the country. That's a little crazy. At the same time she employed a Chinese spy, her husband made tens of millions of dollars winning lucrative government contracts in China. Think those two are connected? Probably. I can't say for certain, but that's just a little bit too much of a coincidence if it's not. The bullet train to nowhere. So you may have heard about the bullet train in California that's costing billions of dollars that nobody wants. That's not actually a bullet train. That's the crazy thing. So people have voted against it routinely. It's billions of dollars over budget, and it's years behind schedule, and it's not even a bullet train, and it's going to nowhere. Nobody wanted it, but it got pushed through. Guess whose husband also has a big part in building that? Dianne Feinstein. You got it. And of course, we had the Kavanaugh hearings, right? So a lot of the midterm elections were kind of a referendum on not just President Trump's candidacy, but how ridiculous Democrats acted during the Judge Kavanaugh confirmation hearings of the Supreme Court. And Dianne Feinstein, she was the center show, right? So if a lot of the fervor about the midterm elections was based off the Kavanaugh hearings, and Dianne Feinstein was front and center, just ridiculousness. She was the ringmaster of the circus. Wouldn't you think that she would be one of the people that would catch the most ire, even in California? Because again, there are a lot of conservatives here in California. It's a huge state. With all those three things, how is it that she won by a landslide against a guy who may be a moron, but he doesn't have three major controversies and claims of corruption against him all at the same time? I don't know. So besides corrupt politicians, there's another big thing on this ballot and on this midterm election that should be a huge red flag. If the other two aren't, this should. And it's the gas tax, right? So this blows my mind, and I just can't see any logical way that this is the actual result of this test. So gas tax here in California. So you hear about California being one of the highest tax states in the nation. So there are two different types of taxes. There's a progressive tax and a regressive tax. A progressive tax is an income tax that charges you more as you make more money. So as you make more, you go into a higher income tax bracket, your taxes get progressively higher. A regressive tax is called that because it taxes everyone equally. It's not based on income. It's the same amount for everyone. So we have a ton of these in California where you're taxed for basically everything. The gas tax is one of the big ones. Again, I talked about being between Texas and California all the time. My gas here in California is about $1 more expensive for every gallon than it is in Texas because of the gas tax. So the gas tax is essentially a tax that the state of California has put on every single gallon of gas that you have to pay. Now, because so many people have started using fuel-efficient cars here, they're going to go to a new method where they charge you based on how many miles you drive during the year because they just got to get that money. And that's the way the gas tax goes, that price fluctuates depending on how much money they say they need that year. So they don't say the gas tax is going to be $1. They say we need to bring in this much money through the gas tax, and so they set the amount appropriately. People in California are sick of it. Because of how much money we have to pay in income tax and all these other taxes we have, they voted last year to have the exact amount of the gas tax put on their gas receipt, right? Just like you go buy something at the store, you get your sales tax and then your total. How much you paid for stuff, how much sales tax is put on there, and then what your total is. Well, the voters in California put that on a ballot initiative, got enough signatures, and they voted. So that we want to know exactly how much are you stealing from us here in California. We want to know. It's because the roads are terrible. We can tell it's not going there. The schools are failing. We can tell it's not going to schools. What are you doing with the money, and how much of it are you taking? So even though the people voted for it, Sacramento vetoed the people's voice. Right? So the people say, hey, we want to know exactly how much you're stealing from us. Sacramento said, okay, that's nice, but no. There was a gas tax. There was a repeal the gas tax initiative on the midterm election this year. And again, if the results are to be believed, it failed. So people voted against repealing this gas tax that they voted to have listed. They wanted to know exactly how much, but Sacramento vetoed it. People are leaving the state because it just costs too much money, yet they want us to believe that even though the people went through all this effort to get the gas tax amount listed on a ballot and voted to know exactly how much it was, they figured that, I don't know, if these results are accurate, then it would have you believe that people just capitulated and said, okay, we just can't deal with this anymore. We know you're going to charge us an arm and a leg, and we're okay with that. I'm sorry, but I have a hard time believing that. Does it really seem likely that people that would go through that much trouble to get the exact amount put on their ballot, people that are complaining about it, again, I'm around town a lot and I talk to people of all different walks, persuasions, income levels, and everything, and I don't buy that. I don't buy it for $1. So now that we talked about some of the different swamp creatures and the reason that we should have seen a lot of red flags just based on what happened, I want to tell you a little bit about my personal voting experience, voting here as a conservative in California, and something that it's scary, but I've been finding a lot of people, only conservatives, that have had the same exact situation happen to them. So the big thing that happened here, and the reason we call it GOP voter suppression, I received a mail-in ballot a couple of weeks before the election. Okay, no big deal, who cares? The reason that's important is because I didn't request one, right? I didn't request a mail-in ballot, and I got one. Now, the strange thing about this is I only found out after I voted, I was far from the only one. A lot of conservatives received mail-in ballots that they didn't request, or when they went to go vote, they were told they were sent a mail-in ballot, but they had never actually received one. Why is that important? Okay, we'll get into that. We'll get into exactly why it's important. So first off, with all the voter enthusiasm that we'd heard about on both sides, my polling location here was a ghost town. There were at least a dozen different poll workers, and the entire time I was in there, I was probably in there for 30 minutes because I had to do a provisional ballot, I maybe saw 5 people. It was an absolute ghost town, which was a little strange. I was forced to use a provisional ballot. Don't know what a provisional ballot is? Okay, my bad, neither did I. So provisional ballot is basically, it's not a regular ballot, and it's not counted like a regular ballot. It doesn't have to be counted for up to 30 days. Okay, there's some very strange things about the provisional ballot, and please, if nothing else, I hope this election and this video at least helps people understand exactly what that is. So provisional ballot doesn't have to be counted immediately. So even though we've heard all of these election results and who the winners are, even if this is done correctly and the provisional ballots are actually counted, they don't have to be counted until December. So somehow Gavin Newsom won, Dianne Feinstein won, and the gas tax failed to be repealed, even though there are tons of these out there that haven't been counted. That's strange. Okay, so all these conservatives that were sent mail-in ballots that did not request them or were told they were sent them had to use provisional ballots that are not counted. Why did they have to use a provisional ballot? So the state of California is saying, well, you know what, I'll get that in a little bit because we need to go through and actually discuss this. So one of the big things about the provisional ballot that really got my spidey senses going was when I went to go turn in my ballot. Right, so when I signed in, they said we don't have you. Oh, they said we found your name. You have to use a provisional ballot because you got a mail-in and you didn't bring it to surrender. Okay. I had to bring my provisional ballot back to the same person that I signed in with. She had to check off on it, make sure it was okay. She took me to go turn it in the middle of the room, the polling location. I handed it to the lady that's in front of this big gray container where she's putting all the ballots, and she took my provisional ballot and put it over the side in a different pile. I had my future stepdaughter with me, and when I get argumentative, I can get argumentative. So I didn't want to get into it there. I wanted to do as much research as I could and figure out what really was happening before I kind of got into it and said something that wasn't accurate. I wanted to know everything. So gave it to her, saw it get put in a different pile, and just decided to go home and figure out what was going on. So I went home to figure out what was going on. I started doing some research. And at first I found a video by Thomas Wichter. If you don't know who Thomas Wichter is, another one I highly suggest you check him out. He's a very funny, intelligent person. I believe he has an intelligence background based on some of the things that he talks about and just how much he knows about geopolitics. But that's beside the point. You should go check him out on YouTube, Thomas Wichter. He's been kicked off of Twitter, Facebook. He was on Gab until they got deplatformed. Now he writes on Quad Verum with Salmontis Bradley and some other notable conservative voices. But go check him out. Thomas Wichter on YouTube. Hilarious. So that day that I got back from voting, I found a video by him named "I Am Smarter Than the Entire California Government." So what he goes through and talks about there is him having the same exact experience I had. Except he's lived in California his whole life. He's been taken off of the voter rolls or disenfranchised at least 2 times. There's been a lot of goofy stuff. Again, watch his videos and he'll go through and explain how his entire life, he's a openly conservative voice, big fan and friend of Roseanne's and some other notable figures. So the California government has done some pretty crazy things to keep him from being able to vote, which is insane. But go through and watch that video and understand. So the same thing that happened to me happened to him, and that's really, really what got my spidey senses tingling a little bit more. I started looking a little bit more, and I found a Twitter thread from Scott Laughlin that I've retweeted, and I will link it in the notes here as well. Scott had gone through himself and done some research to figure out what was going on. What's with these provisional ballots, and why are conservatives having to use them? So he found out that in September of 2018, this year, just in time for the midterm elections, the Democrats changed the law just in time, right? So the Democrats, again, this is a heavily Democrat-controlled state, so they can do pretty much whatever they want unchallenged. Because we have the jungle primary system, you know they're always going to be in control, and they can do pretty much whatever they want. So this new change to the law says that mail-in ballots can be set aside until the signatures can be verified, right? If you don't bring your mail-in ballot and give it to them at the polling location when you vote in person, you have to use a provisional ballot. On top of that, if you use a provisional ballot or mail-in ballot, they can be set aside until the signatures are verified. So here's an important question. If I didn't request a mail-in ballot and I didn't enter my signature for it to be verified against, what are they verifying my signature against, right? The only thing I can think of that California would have on file with my signature is the DMV, and that's from 10 years ago. I want you to look at your signature. Think, especially in your 20s and 30s. Does your signature always stay exactly the same? No. And it just, it seems very, very strange, and it gets worse. So the way the law is written now, if they need to verify your signatures, again, against no signature being given, they have to send you a letter 8 days before the certification of the election, which is in December here in California. Now, on top of that, they have to send it to you at least 8 days before, and it has to be back at least 2 days before certification. So there's a 6-day margin in there between when they have to send it to you by and when you have to have it back to them. So this entire, your vote is dependent on not just going there, but on the United States Postal Service, which, believe me, is not any better here in California than it is anywhere else in the country. It is dependent on you actually opening up your mail every day. Again, you have a 6-day margin between getting it, filling it out, and sending it back. And I'm sorry, but with the advent of email, people just don't open mail as much as they used to. I know some people are really very diligent about it. A lot of people don't. It's got to have the correct address. How many times has your mail been sent to the wrong place, right? So again, you didn't request a mail-in ballot. How can they be sure they have the right address? And I want to see, I'll be interested to see in a few months how many of these were accidentally sent to the wrong address. This reminds me a lot of the mail-in rebate scam. So I'm in marketing. I've been in marketing for quite a while. There's a thing called the mail-in rebate scam, right? Where companies, instead of actually giving you a discount, they'll give you the mail-in rebate, which is money off. Now, the reason they do that is because they quantify how many people, out of the people that actually get a mail-in rebate, how many of them are not going to bother returning it? They're going to lose the thing they got to mail in. They're just not going to take the time to do it. And if you look at the data, it's a significant number. So companies know that instead of giving you, 20% off, they give you this thing that says you're going to get a mail-in rebate. But if less than 5% of the people who buy their product actually do that, they don't have to give anybody a rebate. But they can advertise that there's a discount via this mail-in rebate. So it's trickery, but it's what it really, and that's what this reminds me of, because the statistics are out there. You know how low the number is of people that are actually going to take that second action. And that's exactly what this reminds me of. There is also a video of a Northern California poll worker that came forward saying that the same thing happened up north. So not just here in Los Angeles, where I and Victor are, but actually up north of Monterey, which means this thing's going on around the state. There's a guy named Ron Basilian. His Twitter handle is Ron for California, and he's requesting anybody that had these same experiences I did, send him something on Twitter, letting him know about your experience. He's actually going through and compiling as many of these as he can. So again, that's Ron for California on Twitter. If you're listening to this and you had the same kind of experience that I or Thomas Victor or Scott Laughlin had, please reach out. Again, that's Ron for California. Let him know you've got another story about that. So now we've got to dig into another piece of this puzzle that again, the timing and the incidents and what exactly happened, it's just a little too much for me. I don't believe in coincidences. And there's a lot of things that were just way too coincidental for me. So we're going to talk about the California wildfires that all just happened to start 2 days after the election, when people started digging into what happened and conservatives here started figuring out that something goofy had gone on to a lot of them. This is hitting pretty close to home for me. So I live in a neighborhood where my entire neighborhood was full of smoke for about 2 weeks. We had to evacuate my future stepdaughter here because her dad's neighborhood was completely on fire. We had to bring her here. We had to bring her dog here. We had to let one of my future stepson's friends come here because he had driven in town for work, and the wildfires had closed the highway, so he couldn't get back out, right? So that was it. This has been pretty close to me, at least. I'm glad that I like a full house, but it upended a lot of our lives. Future stepson school was canceled, all kinds of crazy stuff. So I'm not just writing this as a casual observer, right? I'm writing this as somebody whose life was directly affected by this stuff going on, by these fires. And I want to reiterate, I am in no way saying the shooting or the fires were not real. I'm just pointing out some very strange timing. And especially with the wildfires, we know that there's complicity here. We know that there is, I will go through exactly how we know that California government is up to no good. Whether this was on purpose or not, they directly led to these fires. So we have to look at the timing, the events, and what led to the situation to really kind of get a better picture of all these things that happened. So first off, the Thousand Oaks shooting was the day after the election, right? Talk about crazy timing. Again, if it's coincidence, it's coincidence. Okay. Just as conservatives began discussing the stuff that happened, just as people started figuring out that this same non-requested mail-in ballot was being sent to a lot of people, that a lot of conservatives here in the state were forced to use a provisional ballot, there's a shooting that takes over all media. So while you heard of the voting shenanigans that were going on in Arizona and Texas and Georgia and everywhere else, all media that was talking about California was talking about the shooting. And then the next day, they began talking about the fires. Now, there's another really weird coincidence here. And there's been a couple of open source stories. I linked them in my article. I linked one of them in my article, that there were 50 or 60 people at the Thousand Oaks shooting who had also been at the Las Vegas shooting. The crisis actor thing, I don't know if I believe in that or not. I've seen some pretty weird stuff. I don't know how much faith I put in that, but again, I don't really believe in coincidence, and that's a little nuts. That's a little much for me to take in, that many people who were at the Las Vegas mass shooting event were also at this one in Thousand Oaks. That's just strange, to put it lightly. So I said California politicians are directly complicit. How exactly are they complicit? So even if these fires were not intentionally set, they are responsible because of their actions. I'm not sure where you grew up. I've spent a lot of my life in wooded areas. I grew up in a heavily wooded suburb north of Houston. When I went through the Special Forces qualification course at Fort Bragg, I basically lived in the woods for about 2 years while we were doing that. If you've grown up around woods or forests, you know a lot about fire prevention measures, right? They're very important. If you live in any place that has large forest or just a lot of trees in general, you realize how extremely important it is. In the Q course, even our training areas, we would routinely have to move our training areas because they were doing controlled burns or tree removal or some kind of fire prevention measures, because North Carolina is a heavily wooded state. California used to do that. California has not only a heavily wooded state, but it's also a very, very dry climate. Used to do that. Why not anymore? Well, in 2017, Governor Jerry Moonbeam Brown cut nearly $100 million from the fire prevention budget. And he cut another $50 million from the dead tree removal and emergency water tank program. Now, that's put into context here. It costs about $1,000 to remove a dead tree from a lot of parts here in California. And he cut it by $50 million. So you can see basically how much he decimated that. There's some other crazy things going on where environmentalists here in California have filed injunctions with the Forestry Service, so they couldn't actually remove trees that were dead. So these trees that had long died, that were now full of nothing but beetles and had become kindling, they couldn't clear away. Timber companies couldn't come do it, but the Forestry Service couldn't do it either. So we essentially just have created forests full of kindling, just waiting for the right spark, which was a little nuts. Why would Governor Brown do that? Why would he go through and cut $100 million from the fire prevention budget and $50 million from the dead tree removal budget? Well, 3 months after President Trump took office, he signed Executive Order 13768 against sanctuary jurisdictions, basically saying that if you're a sanctuary jurisdiction, city or state, you're not eligible to receive federal funding except for under extenuating circumstances. So after President Trump signed that EO, he basically told California, you are going to lose federal funding if you're a sanctuary state. So Governor Brown, instead of taking away the sanctuary state, cut $100 million from the fire prevention budget so he could maintain that. Now, I think it's also important to note that the Supreme Court here in California just ruled that unconstitutional for it to be a sanctuary state, and there are a lot of voters that voted against sanctuary city status. So that's good, but still it doesn't stop the fact that he did this. To make up for loss of federal funding from the sanctuary state status, he specifically cut from the fire prevention budget in a state that's very dry and heavily wooded and prone to fires, right? So there was a very predictable outcome to this, very predictable. And of course it happened. So after cutting the budget in 2017, last year, fire damage has tripled in California. So the yearly average over a 5-year average was about 230,000 a year, and it tripled to 621,000 this year, acres burned. So it tripled between when he cut $100 million last year and where we are right now. There were additional 345 fires over the 5-year average from 27 to 18. This is absolutely insane. This was found by Doc Rock 1007, by the way, and I'll put his tweet thread in there as well. But it's insane and it's predictable. So let's just reiterate this timeline here. Trump gets into office 3 months later. He signs the sanctuary state executive order saying that if you are a sanctuary state or city, you're not eligible for federal funding. California cut the fire prevention budget to make up for that loss of federal funding. So out of all the things they could have cut, they cut the fire prevention budget in a state that happens to burn quite a bit. Fires in California expectedly triple over the next year, which is insane. They're not even removing dead trees anymore, so of course they would. Now, the California politicians who have been excoriating President Trump since he got elected, now they're asking for his help. And we saw a lot of great pictures and clips from last week when President Trump was with Jerry Moonbeam Brown and Gavin Swamp Creature Newsom down here surveying some of the damage in Paradise. But this brings up a very good point. Now, if you're a follower of QAnon, I am very much so. I've written a couple articles about it, and I'm working on another one right now. This is not the first time that you've heard this theory about California, but it's something that we must go over here. So how does a state get extra emergency money from the government? So if a state has something that happens and they don't have the budget to take care of it, how do they get money from the federal government? They declare a state of emergency, right? So we hear about that with hurricanes, tornadoes. Here in California, you hear about it with fires. What determines the amount of money they get? It's the size of the emergency. So that's a very important thing to factor in to all these different events that have been coming on, is that they lost their federal funding. They cut $100 million from the fire prevention budget. The state catches on fire. They declare a state of emergency, and they ask the federal government to pay for the thing they cut the budget from. A very expected outcome, right? This is either diabolically brilliant, or it's an extreme coincidence that I can't even compute the mathematical numbers for. It's insane. So California government cut $100 million in fire prevention, and now they get the federal government to bail them out of the easily predictable damage. And all they had to do was let the state burn. Notice none of those fires were near Sacramento. They were down here in Southern California. There was one, 2 in the Los Angeles area, and 1 in the Paradise up near the Bay Area, but none of them in Sacramento. So you got to ask, with the events in such an unusual time, order, and method. Remember the time, elections, people start talking about the elections, shooting, fire, right? Just coincidence? Okay, coincidence. At what point does it become mathematically impossible for this to be a coincidence? With all these things that are happened in this way, at this time, in this order, at what point is it mathematically impossible for it to be a coincidence? I personally don't believe in coincidences. I like to take the Roman method. I ask the Roman question from Cassius. Cui bono? Who benefits? Who benefits from all this? Right? So essentially, if this is not a coincidence, California politicians were able to keep sanctuary state status, cut from something they knew was very much needed in this state. There are a lot of extraneous things that the state pays for, but they chose to cut from the fire prevention budget. And when the state catches on fire, they declare a state of emergency and know they can just go to the federal government to get money and planes and help for that. It's okay. If it's a coincidence, it's a pretty big coincidence. The thing that makes this very personal for me is that I can see and smell these fires, right? I'm an avid outdoorsman. I love the outdoors. I think everybody in Special Forces is. I love the outdoors. I love the smell of a campfire. I like it when I get back from camping and my clothes smell like campfire. But to walk out of my back door and smell a campfire because it's a neighborhood just down the road from me that's burning, that's a little unsettling. That's not quite the same experience as smelling a campfire. So this made this very personal to me, right? This came very close to my future stepson's school, my future stepdaughter. When we evacuated her from her dad's neighborhood, the fires were, just a block away. It was pretty nuts. And so I shudder to think that somebody could do this on purpose. But again, when you look at the order and the events and the methods and all the things that happened, it's very hard to just completely discount that all of those things happened at that time in that order coincidentally. It really is. Now, another key important thing to look at is that there have been a lot of fires in California lately. Most of them have been found to be man-made. There were even fires not too long ago that they found out firefighters themselves were setting the fires in order so they could go and have work, right? Crazy. And that's the thing. A rational, normal person does not want to believe that somebody else can do things that are these diabolical and terrible. This diabolical and terrible. But unfortunately, there are people out there that will do some pretty terrible things. It's hard for us to conceptualize that as a normal person. That was part of my job as a Green Beret, was have to get into the mind of some pretty evil people to try to figure out what they were doing so how we could catch them. And unfortunately, you really realize through doing those exercises and actually getting some of these people and talking to them, you realize there are some very bad people out there that will do just about anything for money or fame or power or whatever it is. And again, we don't want to believe that that happens, but we see that it does. We've seen a lot that it does. Just since the 2016 election, we've seen levels of treachery previously unheard of. Hillary Clinton, Peter Strzok, Bruce Orr, James Comey, John Brennan, and the media themselves, who have been completely complicit. Even the Blasey Ford and Justice Kavanaugh. Just the hearings there, just looking at what people did, looking at their reactions, looking at the blatant lies from politicians, from media pundits, from all over the place. Not to even bring in Dr. Blasey Ford, just everything around her and then her. If you read my article on the Kavanaugh controversy, you know that she got caught in multiple lies, blatantly lying about things in her past, but media doesn't want to bring it up. So we know people will do some pretty crazy things to get their way. Now, if you're a follower of Q, this is not the first time you've heard this stuff, but it's important to reiterate, right? Q said, watch California. I'm not sure if this is what he meant or something else, but being that I'm here in California and I saw some pretty disgusting things go down, not just in voting, but also in the fires, the way people reacted to it, the things that were completely drowned out of the media because of the fires. Again, I see a lot of connections here and a lot of things that happen in ways that, in my personal opinion, I believe it's mathematically impossible to be coincidence. So we had election shenanigans in Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Texas. You're not hearing about them in California, but I am here telling you that they were happening here in California. it's showing you just how low the DNC will go. Now, up until now, they had the consent decree, which meant they basically couldn't get in trouble for any kind of election integrity issues. But now, like many things, that all ended under President Trump, and they can. We're going to have a report pretty soon about the election issues from this midterm, and I'm very interested to see what they come out and say. Again, normal people just can't comprehend. You know, people don't want to believe that a politician will lie or do terrible things to maintain office or stranglehold in power or money, but just Hillary Clinton alone. If you haven't read the book Clinton Cash, you should. It outlines just the disgusting, not just the pay-for-play, but the warlords that she was working with. I mean, just the raping of certain countries, not just Haiti, but the things that she did in Central Africa, helping friends of hers that went in there for mining contracts. I mean, absolutely disgusting stuff. So we've seen just how low some of these people will go to maintain their grip on power. So again, in closing, I'm not telling you what to believe. I just want to put out information. I'm giving you my firsthand account. I'm giving you other firsthand accounts that I've found and the crazy things that I've seen going on here. But most importantly, do your own research, right? So when I write an article, I go through and I hyperlink a lot of links to other open source media and other things that I've found to verify so that you can go through and see for yourself. I'm not making this up. You can go through and check out other articles from other mainstream media sources and see other articles that have been written, other news conferences, other things that have gone on. So do your own research, please. I think that's one thing that social media has destroyed, and education. Honestly, I got 4 kids, 2-step and 2 of my own kids, that it's unfortunate, but instant gratification has lost the ability for a lot of people to go through and do their own research and form their own opinions and do a lot of things. So I'm asking you, please do some research. If you see something that doesn't make sense, if you see 2 news stories that don't add up, if one has something and another has some significant pieces taken out of it, like the NPR story I talked about, please go do your own research. Figure out why. Find out what that writer usually writes about, or why would they specifically take that missing piece out of the puzzle? Why do things happen? If something happens in a very strange order, look at it, just look at it. Just dig, just do a little bit of digging. It normally does not take that much. You go through and see if something fishy is up. So do your own research. Keep your powder dry. We are living in some very strange times. There is just a lot of really crazy things going on out there. So stay close to your family. Keep your powder dry. That just means be prepared for anything, because there are some very strange things going on. So be ready for anything. Here in California, we always keep a significant amount of emergency supplies, just because the Northridge earthquake was just a decade ago, and it cut all highway communication in and out. Power was down, everything else. So if you're in California, or if you're anywhere else that's prone to natural disasters, water, food, MREs, there's a lot of stuff you can have. I wrote a book called The Pact that is about the country being invaded, that I went through a lot of detail to outline specifically what type of emergency supplies people should have, how we use them, how they're implemented. So not trying to plug my own book, but let me plug it. The Pact, you can go get it on Audible or on Amazon. But at least know, even if not that, do your own research and figure out what you should have. So do your own research, keep your powder dry. Remember, there are good people and good politicians out there. It's just when we hear about the bad ones, it disgusts us so much that it's really hard to get that taste out of our mouth. But there are good ones out there. I think they're doing everything they can to try and keep this country safe and get us back on the right track. So please say a prayer for them. Keep them in your hearts and minds. Love your family. Enjoy your friends. And until next time, I'm Robert Patrick Lewis for Heroes Media Group.